Thank you. So I want to talk about a question that we debated whether to open it as a mystery and put a question mark and move the wood up front. But we decided to fess up and say that we actually know the answer, which is yes, older Americans would work longer if jobs were more flexible. That's what I'm going to try and demonstrate to you. In so doing, I want to give thanks where thanks are due. First and foremost in this particular thing, I'd like to thank Caplin Christensen, basically for driving research in an important direction. Until I became an adult, I didn't understand that grant officers mattered. When you become an adult, you figure out that part of the reason you do research in particular directions is because somebody thinks it's important. And in this case, it was Caplin, and she's led and thinks it's important, and I think she's right. I also want to thank Joel and the Vanguard group, where's Joel gone, and John Ameriks, who we're working with from Vanguard, and they've been wonderful supporters of the type of research that we do. Then I want to introduce my co-author, Chris, and mention other wonderful co-authors as listed here: Joseph Briggs, Minjoon Lee, Matthew Shapiro, John Ameriks of the Vanguard group. So that's the team. What are we doing? Well, this is part of a project that isn't all about substance. It's partly about method. And the method question is, how do you investigate what people would do if? And since most of economics is concerned at some point with turning around from the world as it is and saying, I would like to consider how things would change if the world was different, what if questions are the bread and butter of the profession. And we have various approaches for handling them, and I want to discuss a way of enriching the evidentiary base for what-if questions. And the approach will be based on surveys. Here's the, by the way, the Federal Reserve Board doesn't necessarily agree with us, you should know. Nor does the Vanguard group, depending on whether we say anything threatening. All right, so why did Caplin think that this was a big subject? Well, because there's a lot, in case none of us has noticed, there's a lot of aging going on. And as we each individually experience that, we look around and note that we're not alone. And that society as a whole appears to be aging. And that, anyway, in the optimistic take that I have, that one day that will return to the US, that it will be an aging society. And that if you want to understand whether you can solve the extremely large cost problems associated with an aging population, you'd be interested in knowing whether people might be willing to work longer. And in fact, it's a globally interesting question. Why aren't people working longer? Would they like to? And if they were to do so, in the end, you put that into policy questions and you get potentially wonderful answers that there are many ways out of the policy binds that we're in. The fundamental to our approach is the observation that using behavioral data to separate out why most people stop working by 62 or 65, typically in the US, separating out the extent that that's driven by the usual reason in an economic model, which is that after all, you always hated working, and by a certain point in time, either the benefit system has clicked in for you, or your wealth is enough for you, that finally you can get out of this dreadful thing that you were doing and take your well-deserved rest, and that's really what you want to do your whole life. It was always negative that you were working. That might be true. On the other hand, it could be that you were becoming a bit of a drag on the old corporation that had, or the institution that had kept you employed. And after a while, they looked for any excuse and found a way, either on schedule or off schedule, to leverage you out. So it's either that they don't want you or you don't want to work. Either way, you end up leaving the labor force. That seems a bit of a thin observational base to separate out the factors at play. So we'd like to enrich that behavioral, enrich beyond the behavioral data. Now, you can do many things, and there are many wonderful things that labor economists, and we're very happy to be doing anything of the sort and structural modelers will do to assess the impact of policy changes, and many people in the room. We're going to try to go a little bit beyond, and we're also going to use going beyond to address a very interesting side question, which is, in addition to preferences to smooth consumption, economic models contain incentives to smooth labor supply, which makes it rather interesting that it tends to go from work full-time to work not at all, with a discrete thing called retirement, which is a phrase Kathleen doesn't like at all. Again, these forces are a little hard to separate with pure behavioral data. So given that I'm taking a long time giving you the preamble, I'll give you the conclusion, and then if I have to rush at the end, you won't mind. Okay. Why, by the way, did we pursue the question of if jobs were flexible? Well, it's not totally trivial to define what flexible means. But whatever it does mean, it does seem that there's a different style of job sought by those. It would be a theory that it's a different, it's certainly a fact, there's a different style of job held by those later in life. And it's an interesting theory that they were seeking it. And the style of job might be what typically a bridge job, and in the bridge job you wouldn't work quite as long, and you might have a flexible schedule, you might even be self-employed. There's a different job mix for older than younger workers. That might reflect the fact that, or maybe they want different things in the job, and flexibility comes to matter. And we find this for sure, that it does seem to be, in our sample, a different mix of jobs. So therefore, theoretically, driven by the evidence, we wanted to take flexibility particularly seriously as a type of characteristic. Okay. So what do we do to go beyond what choice data alone gives? Well, we talk. We essentially run a conversation. If you think of a survey as a highly structured conversation with the respondent. And in doing this, we're building on the tradition of the HRS of asking probability questions and thinking that people will look inside and do their best guess of how likely am I to be working at 65? How likely am I to be working at 62? We're going to push that a little harder and ask them, what would you do if? How would you respond to the following? And our theory is going to be that they answer with honest purpose. May not be the truth, but it's kind of roughly what they think they would do in the circumstance you laid out, especially if it's not got too much need to present yourself in an artificial way. Just like, tell me what you would do in the following contingency, and we've been doing this for many years, have become extremely comfortable that there's information contained in the responses we get from our very bright, very, very bright people who fill in the Vanguard Research Initiative. I just want to say we know that because we interact with them sometimes in chats after they've filled the surveys. And the only kind of thing they say to us is, we enjoyed the survey, we kind of understood what you were asking, we tried to answer it, but why are you talking to me now? I've got things to do. And they kind of like, they seem like quite with it, all right? So our theory is going to be that they answer the question with fairly good, honest purpose. And here, therefore, is the type of question we ask. Now, you have to understand that before this, we've taken people through their employment history. So we're not the Danish registry. We don't have all that data. So we have to ask people, tell me about your history on the labor market. We made clear at the beginning of the survey, this is the survey 4 in the Vanguard Research Initiative that we've been conducting for close to a decade. We're asking them, we've warned them this is all going to be about labor and labor supply. And we've asked them to talk to us through, in a very structured way, their labor market history. So we now have quite detailed visions of what's happened to them in the past. That's a factual section. So let's get the facts laid out. Where were you employed? We've asked them something, and it will include things like, what was the longest job you held? Because we didn't want to ask everything. It's very, very hard to get a history in a survey. So we had to get an edited history. In the edited history, we had to decide what's most important. And therefore, the first thing we asked was about their most important position, if they had one. And by that, we said the longest position you held after age 40, the position you held for the longest time. So we didn't want the early experience. We want to make sure that, and by the way, everybody is 55 plus. And so we then have down something called a reference employment situation. Why am I giving you this preamble? You can't read this question unless you understand how they read it. It says there's a reference employment situation which we constructed and put in their mind, and it was typically their career job. If they had had several jobs beyond their career job, it was their latest bridge job. About that, we knew some things. We'd asked them to tell us more about that situation in terms of the type of work it entailed and the wages they were paid. So now they have a reference in mind when they come upon this question. We've taken a break before these questions, and we say we're now going to ask you some hypotheticals. And in asking these hypotheticals, we're very clear in laying them out, and we also test them on how well they understand the question before they answer. We give them good response devices intended to be neutral. So now we're going to offer people, and these people, many of them, by the way, are not working anymore. So we're going to ask them right now, today, as of the time of the survey, you're just about to receive an offer. This offer will be available for a short time, and we're going to ask you if you'd like to accept it or not. And it is a new employment situation that involves a fixed work schedule. Now, let me just clarify. Since we're exploring the value of flexibility versus fixity, we'd ask them the characteristics of their current job, and that typically was fixed schedule. But we had to define what we meant now by a fixed schedule, and it said, look, you've got to work 40 hours, 48 weeks a year, or some such thing. It's very, very rigid, kind of, that's called the fixed schedule. And even if your current job wasn't exactly that, this is what the job we're going to offer you will come with, fixed schedule. Other than this possible difference, because we don't know if they think that's different or exactly what they had, the new employment situation matches your reference employment situation in terms of occupation, annual earnings, and all other characteristics. Option B is we're going to leave you and you've got a good life. Do exactly what you would do from now on. Okay, that's the option. Would you choose option A or option B? So that is the first question. Then we go for the reservation wage. We say, okay, we saw what you did, and you accepted that position. Would you have accepted it for a little bit less? And then we try and find out how much less they would have accepted it for. Or if they'd not accepted it, how much higher do we have to go to get you to accept it? So we're looking for those two things. The next figure is probably the most basic in the paper. And I can say that our expectation was that quite a lot of people, even quite late, would be willing to work, but then it's a bit of a negative. In the theory, it's just all negative. You don't want it. These are fairly wealthy people. Most of them don't seem to, quote, need it in the sense. In most of our models, they'd be happily retired. So here's the first figure. We broke it up according to whether the people had a bridge job or did not have a bridge job. And we're looking now at people who are currently retired. They're out of the labor force. And we're finding that more than a third would accept the wage in the position that they used to hold now, many years later. That there's a significant group that would accept a wage reduction of 10%, 20%, or 30% just to retake the job they had. And they are pretty healthy, by the way. It's a very healthy group. If they had a bridge job, that number rises. And that's the group that already demonstrated by their willingness to continue and their desire to continue in the labor force that they were interested in further work. They might now be retired, but they're interested, and they would indeed, more than 40% of them would accept that reference position. And now this one relates to the bridge job. So there's a slight difference between these two figures, because for the people who had a bridge job, the reference position is their last bridge job. And they say, yeah, I'd go back to my last bridge job at that wage. And that's today. And it's fairly flat across the board. Almost everybody is saying this. We've got a mostly healthy sample. Okay, then, now let's make them flexible. In the flexible situation, they're free to choose at the beginning of the year the hours per week and weeks per year. But they're not free to adjust after that. That is, they set it, they send the letter to their employer. We had to decide, what does flexible mean? So to us, flexible meant you do get what you want, but it's an annual contract that you must then meet. You can specify it, and it could be 25 hours, and I think included I want summers off, but you specify it, okay? And then we'll see what happens. That's in their mind, okay? And that's the wedge. So now what happens is that with flexibility, more than 50% would say yes today. And among the bridge job people, 2/3 would say yes today. So this is people out of the, I mean, I don't know. Do they like working or something? I don't know. But certainly, whatever the terror of work is, it's not showing up in this figure. And flexibility is looking like a big margin for this group. And so that's the paper. I'm going to go over a little bit more how we get there, but that is the heart of the matter. And then I'll go into a technical thing we do, which is show that our questions, we'd ask them richly enough that they could pin down a parameter in a standard labor supply model. And in particular, they could pin down an intertemporal elasticity of substitution, which made you say, in essence, let me be blunt about what this slide says. It says the way to explain our findings is that firms didn't want to pay for part-time workers. They're not worth it. That would have to be what's going on, not the preference parameter. Firms didn't want part-time workers. Okay, and let me tell you a little bit more about who we're doing this with. I'll go much quicker through these slides. That's the paper. Now I'll give you the how we do it. It's the Vanguard Research Initiative. This is a group of people who are at least 55 years old, internet eligible, at least 10,000 at Vanguard. We've got survey, we're on, I think we're doing survey 6 in the field right now. We have almost 3,000 respondents who've gone through enough waves that we have their information used in this paper. Then they're wealthier, far healthier, significantly better educated than representative sample. Just the way it is. With sample selection, similar, that's the only slide I might disagree with. I would have put similar in quote marks because they're very healthy. They're pretty wealthy and they're very bright. But in the truth is that their labor market participation and career job characteristics look like that group in the HRS. They may have many other differences, but it's not that their job patterns are wildly different. A little bit more professional. And now I can tell you that, you know, of our sample, most are actually retired. We asked, are you retired completely? Are you just not working? Are you with, you know, so by the end of our sample, most people are retired completely from the labor force. So they characterize themselves as out of the labor force. And this is, in fact, the group that's telling us I would be perfectly comfortable jumping back in. And we have strong evidence, to agree with everybody else's evidence, that flexibility is seeming to matter in career choices late in life. What we find is that the bridge jobs generally involve fewer hours. That's what this table says. The salaries aren't all that wildly different per hour on average, but that means pay is lower because people are working less. And there's a lot more self-employed in bridge jobs, a lot more people reporting that they had flexible schedules, many fewer having health insurance on the job. That's a brief summary of differences. And then this slide is about another thing we investigated, which was search behavior. Because we were very interested to know, well, did you look? And what did you look for? Because if we're going to get this finding that many people would work, then does that mean that they would search? And now, of course, there's a good answer to that question, which is no. The answer to the question of, because I want a job, I will search, is, well, why? Because you're not going to find anything. There's an equilibrium object, the thing that you expect to go round and find if you were to search. And you may be fully aware that it's pointless. So not search despite wanting the job that's on offer, that we've just offered them. So what they've said is, boy, if somebody could set up a staging post and offer the offer you just offered me, and I could walk to it, I would take it. So yes, well, did you search? No, because I know there's no such staging post. Why should I search? It's pointless. And we do know that flexibility was something that was being sought in among those who did search. So again, we're getting this evidence that flexibility is a core construct at this point in the career. Now I want to point out that we go through a heavy design process, and we decide, you know, in the team, which types of questions to pose, how to pose them, and what interface to use, and how to test people for their comprehension. And what we did was we investigated at the time of the survey, that is, we're asking you now, would you take this job with a fixed schedule, with a flexible schedule? And we also offered them an alternative occupation. Said, look, is there somewhere else you'd like to be working? And if so, you know, kind of think about that a little bit, and we'll offer you that and see when you'll take it. But we also were interested to know, look, I mean, that question was being posed as of now to a retiree. Maybe they would have given a different answer and a more important answer pragmatically at the time that they left their last job. So we placed them back then and said, look, suppose, try to remember if you can, what it would have been like to face this offer had you, at the moment you just finished your job. Okay? And again, we're going to ask you fixed, flexible, alternative occupation. And then we did a bunch of questions about search, and we asked workers about their continuation in jobs, but I'm not going to get into survey question 2 here. And now, this slide refers to, I think I'm just repeating the slide I showed you at the beginning of what we found. Okay, I don't need to tell you about it. I told you about it already. This is the slide that said, would current retirees return to work? And the answer is lots of them, yes, especially with a flexible job, even in the face of a wage increase. And oh boy, if they took a bridge job, 100%. Okay, the question posed as of the past, I should have done it this way. I should have kept you in suspense. I could have, but now you know. So the question, we've now gone back and we've said, like, think back to you at the moment of retirement, not you now that you're 4 years out of the job. At that moment, would you have accepted our offer? And maybe our theory was that more of them would have accepted then, and that, as you've now seen, was false. In general, fewer of them would have accepted them then. In particular, flexibility seems to make less difference thought of back then. I'm not going to make a big thing of this fact, but I would point out it's kind of interesting that it may be that this is slight evidence of the kind of burnout phenomenon, that they were feeling a little differently about work at the time that they quit, or the time that they left, than they are now. And if anything, their taste for work is greater now than it was at that time. So it doesn't look like retirement is addictive, put it that way. But the reduction in hours was not crazy. They weren't saying, if we give you a flexible schedule, I'd like to work 3 hours a week. And then we could explain that that's a bit of a joke. No employer is going to pay for it. No, they want kind of a 10% reduction in the time that they're going to work, something like that, typically. All right, now there are two things that loom large in this agenda. One of them is, do we believe a word they're saying? And the center of the agenda driving forward will be to find out when to believe and when not to, and to design good tests of that. It's very much, I think, like the relatively early days of the probability literature, where you want to know, first order, the probabilities, are they lawful? Do they vaguely add to 1? You know, kind of, is it at least 1.5 or below, or something like that? But you don't want probabilities to add to 48, and you don't want people to give completely random-looking answers. And there's every bit of evidence. I mean, I would say a lot of this paper is an implicit credibility check, because people are giving really coherent story. And it's much easier to tell your story coherently than it is to tell a lie coherently. Like, that's a good way of trapping somebody, is to ask them 18 questions about the person they imagine themselves to be. And by the 5th one, they have no idea how to talk about themselves because it's a fantasy. If you ask somebody about themselves, at least they know who they are. They can check it out. They can give you a coherent picture. We also test them on credibility, and they did well. They understood what we were asking. That doesn't mean they were telling the truth. Then there were various consistency checks we've run and reasonableness checks. So although all the correlations that you would expect, but this isn't a strong test. I mean, it's just saying, first order, it's credible that they were thinking about what we were asking and answering honestly. There are slightly stronger tests, but I'm not going to stress it. You could look to see if we asked people, why did you leave? And for some of them, they said, I was basically booted out of the job. And for those ones, you'd expect them to be more interested, and they were. And now there's a technical exercise we conduct in the paper, because the other purpose of this entire agenda is gradually to use this data to estimate structural models and then estimate policy effects. And we've done that a lot in the past. Those are the earlier papers in the sequence. This one isn't based quite so firmly around a model, but nevertheless, There are model parameters it can shed light on. And the one that we use it to shed light on comes from a Rogerson-Wallenius paper, which does a nice job of describing the challenge of explaining working 40 hours a week and then stopping and going cold turkey to zero. That's a hard thing to explain in a classical model of labor supply in which there's an incentive to smooth labor supply as there is an incentive to smooth consumption. And so how could that be? Well, there are two things. First off, I can have a very weak preference for smoothing. I don't care. You know, give me 40-0, 20-20, what do I care? So then I could just decide, you know, even if you only offer me a 5% reduction, I'm quitting. That's the explanation that comes from the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. Or it could be that the production technology doesn't deal well with me being part-time, and if I was to drop to 20 hours, I'd produce a tenth as much, and that would be called a non-convexity in production. And it's well known that these are very hard to disentangle in behavioral data. And so we use our questions, and what I'm going to show in these slides, which is something you do not need to take in, is the equation that we use to say that we had asked enough questions to uniquely pin down the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, the pure labor supply side of this. And all that can do is say that everything else must be labor demand. And I guess that seems to be, and I can tell you it came out, quote, reasonably, whatever that means. It has to be fairly, you have to get a fairly large cut in wages for working part-time, according to our answers. But that opens up the other side of the scissors, and that's where we'd like to go. The other side of the scissors, look, this is not coming, not working, doesn't happen because people don't want to work, as far as we can tell. Certainly in this class and this group. It happens because somebody doesn't want to hire them. That would be the bottom line. Now, why? Were they overpaid toward the end of career and it's great to get rid of them? I don't know. But we need to know now how to combine this maybe with the style of the resume studies. We'd also like to know what's going on the labor demand side of the market. Now, is there the equivalent of a strategic survey question that maybe enriches the resume and gets a more contingent statement on when I would take somebody on and takes apart their problems, the problems for the employer? Is there a way of designing that instrument so it could join this instrument, and between them we'd either say, you know, the trouble with the firm is it may well be that the legal department would answer the question. I don't know. Hand that to the legal department and say, you know, I refuse to answer this one. I plead the fifth. But I don't know. Maybe one could get some friendly employers to give reasonable answers to questions about, you know, what would you do if I came to you with the following, and then I changed certain characteristics and break it down more discreetly. And that's where we're at. The two things that we'd like the most help on: credibility. How to build the credibility case over time, because I believe we will build a case. I don't think we'll destroy a case. I believe we'll build a case, but of course it will be limited. The idea that there's no information in these questions is, I think, beyond absurd. I can't even take it in. The idea that they're honest and full statements is also absurd. What hybrid? I have no idea. And the second thing is what to do to get both sides of the market so that you can begin to judge why the outcomes are as they are and how those outcomes could be changed.
So this is the big question: why do all the workers don't work, or at least as much as maybe we would want them to work? And there are potential demand issues and supply issues. Perhaps job opportunities don't come along on the demand side, or people develop preferences for leisure, for being retired. and so didn't work. And it's obviously hard to disentangle these two type of considerations. And this paper uses subjective hypothetical question or strategic survey question to anchor the demand side so that supply issues can be isolated. So my journal says it's a clever paper. It's a pleasure to read. There is a creative way of using this type of data for identification purposes. And so I'm going to have just a few comments on the journal context, and then possibly using the data to infer the value of flexibility from the observed choices, or actually from the reported, self-reported choices. And then this is something Andrew already talked about, the neglected dimension of supply, which is search effort. And then we're going to talk about a few model enrichments, which I don't expect to be incorporated, but it's always good to know under what additional assumptions we're actually recovering what we are recovering. Then
working on.
we'll take it with a grain of salt. Okay. So just to reiterate the main findings of the paper. So supply consideration from reading the paper are unlikely to explain the low participation that we see among older workers. And the title, as Andrew said, doesn't have a question mark. He has an exclamation mark. If jobs with the right amount of flexibility were available, older workers would get back to work. And this is the third time you see this picture because it's probably the most relevant picture. So if the last job that people had was available, between 35 to 45% of people, depending on whether they had a big job or not, would go back to work. And this would increase to 55 to 65% if some flexibility was added. And clearly, the willingness to work then declines with the size of the wage cut that people had to suffer. And then this kind of data, there is a translation of these different demand and supply factors into a structural model of consumption, labor supply choices that Andrew didn't put too much emphasis on for obvious reasons. In a model in which there are a fixed cost of work and production non-convexity, this is the Rogerson and Valenius model. And there it is, I mean, the conclusion is that the preference aspect that gets inferred from the model is not too different from what's out there. And so they conclude that it's production non-convexity, or perhaps the demand side, that it's really relevant for explaining the data. So going back to it, so I like a lot the broad idea of the paper. I used it myself. So I use subjective expectation of workers to identify the same parameters that the authors are after, the anesthesia intertemporal substitution. I was looking more at the intensive margin. This paper is more about the extensive margin, but the conclusion in my paper is actually fairly similar. And it kind of highlighted the importance of getting into the information set on individual rather than having the econometrician telling what is observable and what is not observable. So in terms of research agenda, I'm very enthusiastic about the SSQs used in a structural model of behavior. Now, I didn't know too much about the facts, so and I didn't find them in the paper, so I looked at some CPS data myself, and you have already seen a version of this picture in Mike's presentation. So what are the trends in work past retirement? So I looked at people who were 66 to 70, 71 to 75, 66 to 80. And this is the fraction of men and women who report in the CPS to be working full-time or part-time. So the big increase in participation happens more or less in the 90s, and then it continues to this very day. You can see the slowdown that Mike was talking about. And I was wondering whether this was because more flexibility is being offered. So there is a question in the CPS that asks whether people are working full-time or part-time. And so I was expecting part-time to get bigger, but in fact it's getting kind of smaller. So if you look at the group of people who are working and then classify them according to whether they're working part-time or full-time, the fraction of the workers who actually work part-time is declining in all age ranges and independently of gender. So I didn't know whether to interpret this as a puzzle, given the conclusion of the paper, or whether this is, you could have that counterfactual argument. So participation would have been even bigger if jobs with flexibility or jobs with part-time, a strong part-time component would be offered in equilibrium by firms. Or perhaps the sample that they're looking at is a sample of wealthier individuals. Perhaps their demand for flexibility is much stronger than for a representative sample of older workers that we see here. So I'm still not completely sure whether I have to see this as a puzzle or not. So Andrew didn't actually show this picture. It's a very cool picture. It's the distribution of the reservation wages that this guy report. And this kink here, it takes a bit to understand that actually this is two different subsamples. This is a subsample of those who accept their reference job, and this is a subsample of those who actually turn down. And so if they turn down, they ask, how much would you have to be paid in order to actually accept the job? There was actually an older paper that introduced this idea of directly asking people the reservation wage in job search model. So this is a very early reference. Here, the novelty is that the reservation wage distribution is recovered under different kind of scenarios. Under the scenario of being offered a flexible job or a job at the moment of retirement or later in life, so things like that. This adds a lot of complexity. Now, one question we may have is that, you will see some people switching from option B to option A once you offer them the opportunity of a flexible work schedule. So some of the people actually on this side of this picture, once you introduce the flexibility. So I did wonder whether one could get a measure of the value that people attach to non-pecuniary aspects of the job, like flexibility in the working schedule, by using the switchers, the people who switch from option B to option A once the flexibility is introduced. And perhaps there is some sense that the paper is already recovering this in the structural part of the paper. And the basic idea is that people who choose option B are those who say, I prefer to turn down this job because it doesn't have flexibility, but I would still get the job if I was offered a much higher wage, and this would be the reservation wage. But these are the same guys who then, when they get the flexibility, so when this F switches to 1, then they prefer to work, and they would turn down the job only if the wage was sufficiently low. So there is some information here that somehow is not exploited, that tells us perhaps a way of quantifying the demand for flexibility that these workers have. And in fact, one interesting thing is that the production on convexity, which is how the wage increases with the number of hours, somehow seems to be able to be recovered from the switches themselves. In general, I was perhaps more interested in understanding the determinant of the reservation wages that people report, because I was interested in whether there were shifts in the reservation wage that people report as a function of observable characteristics like the wealth of individuals, perhaps the portfolio composition because of background risk consideration, or the time they've been out of the labor market. They will tend, there's different forms of non-stationarity in the reservation wage that might be interesting to look at. So simple regressions of what are the determinants of this reservation wage. This is a point that Andrew made, the anchoring. So they are isolating one component of labor supply. Do you accept or reject a job? Of course, the component that the SSQs don't seem to account is the fact that where there is another component of labor supply, which is the amount of effort you put in the search. And as Andrew said, well, they don't seem to actually put a lot of effort in to start with. When they're asked whether they're searching, 89% say they're not. despite then expressing a demand for flexibility. So obviously, it may be that they are embedding in their responses the fact that those jobs with flexibility don't exist. And then perhaps the firms know that the workers that this represent, the jobs will not offer an equilibrium, and so forth. So you have a little bit of self-fulfilling equilibria that are not very encouraging in a certain way. So if we are thinking about this being an important policy. So I want to spend just a few slides on, this is a very clever idea, separating these two reasons why you might observe this abrupt shift from full-time work to no time, to retirement, without something in between, which is a part-time option. So if you were to smooth leisure, you would expect a more gradual phasing out of your work, but it doesn't happen. We see a lot of people, the vast majority of people don't use bridge jobs with a part-time or a reduced working schedule. So the explanations that are offered in the paper in the Rogers and Van Linius is that either people have a high they have low reluctance to take these big fluctuations in hours. So in terms of parameters, they have a large EIS, or they face production on convexity. This may be the demand side, and this may be the supply side. And so the SSQs are used to pin down the identification issues. So the key identification idea is this. I'm going to have a simplified version of their model because I think it's cool to show what they're doing. So people maximize this. This is consumption, this is leisure, and they have a fixed cost, the time they have to commute, for example, if they work. And this is their budget constraint. This already incorporates non-convexity in production. An individual is offered two scenarios: a fixed working schedule, so H is fixed, or a flexible working schedule. And they report the reservation wage. This is the reservation wage when they accept the fixed schedule. So this makes them indifferent between working at this schedule or enjoying leisure 100% and then being unemployed. And if you use a tailored approximation, you get this. No need to worry too much about this. They also get offered another scenario in which they are offered a flexible working schedule. In this case, they report a different kind of reservation wage. This is the reservation wage that makes them indifferent between working on a flexible schedule and, again, enjoying leisure 100%. But this is the same guy that you have here. So now they can equate these two things here. So do a little bit of tailored approximation and get to this expression, which is a simplified version. So they have this from the survey question. People report directly these two objects. So now, if they make some assumption of H bar, they can recover the curvature of the value of leisure by observing the right-hand side. And because the curvature is related to elasticity into temporal substitution, tough, you got what you needed. And that's the clever exercise of the paper, which I think it's worth reminding because it's something that Andrew didn't. So issues. This is a static, and they're deriving this under a static scenario. But in fact, if there is these non-forms of non-stationarity in the reservation wage, these objects here changes over time. So choices that you would have made at age 65 when you were healthy and not so much wealth in your portfolio, probably you wouldn't make it in the same way when you were 75, where your health was deteriorating, or you had much more wealth, and so the demand for flexibility and the value flexibility would have been much different. So it does actually make sense to go back and look at what changes the reservation wage to be able also to address these possible issues. So let me skip this and say, the two things that I find kind of missing in terms of modeling in the paper are joint retirement. So there is a lot of evidence that a lot of couples, perhaps because they are complementary in leisure, they enjoy life, the end of their life together, they make actually joint retirement decisions. For example, according to HRS data, lots of couples, almost half of the couples, plan and implement joint retirement decisions. So one kind of background question here is whether this lack of participation is because of lack of coordination among spouses rather than more demand issues. And then the non-separability is more like a technical point. I don't really know how this is going to affect the identification strategy. This is a something that, when you see this big decline in leisure, if there is complementarity between consumption and leisure, you also have to accept a big decline in consumption, which is not obvious that people have very strong preferences over. So let me conclude. It's a very nice paper, very clever idea, and I look forward to reading next drafts.
So what you're calling flexible is really a one-year part-time contract, right? I mean, you could imagine much more flexibility than that, such as Uber drivers who every hour they decide whether they want to work or not. But just a comment that this is a limited amount of flexibility.
If you added richer possibilities,
I agree. Yes. Larry and Alan, and then I think it's going to be Larry and Alan, and that's it. I'm sorry.
Here you go. Is flexibility referring to fewer hours? Is it referring to being able to go off to see the doctor's appointment? In which case, I would think you'd want to model this as the uncertainty of your need for time
to say you have to commit at the beginning of the year because you can reduce your hours, but then you send them, ship them to the boss. You still got a boss in that job, and you must agree to the contract. So it's not the minute-to-minute fluctuations that the Uber driver could handle.
See, okay, well, a different question might be for future research is, would you like to work full-time but prefer to be able to take off time for emergency, I mean, older people will have a lot of doctor's appointments, and they might want to work overtime one day and fewer hours another day to make up for it, but they still want to work basically full time.
Well, I think that's a global issue, and I think it's more pressing when you have kids, even than when you're older. But I think it's a global issue, which is how do we haven't done much with the word flexibility. We're starting it, and we noticed that we couldn't go to the good book of what's a flexible job, so we had to roll our own definition, and it's just step one.
Right, yeah.
So a characteristic of our models from the very beginning has been minimum hours constraints, and that's the reason most people don't move into partial retirement. So in a paper where we looked at future policies, we looked at the effects of relaxing minimum hours constraints. And the good news is you got 20% more people moving into partial retirement if you relax them. The bad news is 10% of them came from not retired, but the other 10% came from full-time workers. So the full-time workers leave early enough so that you lose as many hours from full-time workers leaving before they would have otherwise on a partial retirement job as you gain from having more people continue to work longer in a partial retirement job.
So I think we're not handling the equilibrium issue, we're just handling the issue of the preferences on the labor supply side at this point.
But on the labor supply side, it seems to me that the other question you want to look at is, would you have left your job earlier if you had this possibility? Because then you're losing hours among exactly the population that you're trying to get to work longer.
And I'm not trying to impose a policy and say it is a win or a lose. It's an interesting question to ask, what would somebody at an earlier stage who's still working, would they choose a different option if available? That's a very valid question, different one.